guy's offering me the 25 grand to do this. It's fun. It was really helpful. You can just direct deposit it, you know.
We're here with Danny Fingeroth, the former editor of Spider-Man and an author of the new biography of Stan Lee. When did you first get to know Stan Lee?
In 1977. Many of you were probably even born then.
I was a baby.
There you go. My first job was working for Stan's brother, a guy named Larry Lieber, in a department that put out comics specifically to be packaged and sold in England. So it was called the British Department, appropriately enough. And a lot of people got their start there, drawing covers and news splash pages. And we were doing something called Captain Britain, which is a character people know, and that got its start in these Marvel British books. So, I mean, in one sense, I met Stan Lee when I was a kid in the pages of the Marvel comics, because there's that version of Stan Lee that, I'm a baby boomer. I was the prime age and prime audience to have that first wave of Marvel magic kind of come at me at a very impressionable age. I've been reading DC comics. I love superheroes, and suddenly Fantastic Four shows up, and along with it, Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and Steve Ditko, Don Heck, all those early Marvel artists. But it was Stan's personality in the letters pages, in the bullpen bulletins, in the comics themselves. So, I mean, there was a version of Stan Lee that I got to know as a little kid. The version I got to know as an adult, I don't have any great the first time I met Stan story, because he was still coming to the office every day. So Stan was somebody you saw, didn't interact with that much, but especially, say, if Larry was on vacation or on a business trip, I would have to go get covers approved by Stan. So, I mean, I have bits and pieces of memories. I'd say the most, I guess I got to spend a little time with him when all the editors went out to the San Diego convention in '83, and we spent time. We also went to LA and spent time at Stan's house and at Marvel Productions. And then I actually edited Stan's work many times, starting with the Spider-Man annual in 1984 that had the wedding of J. Jonah Jameson in it. And that was very cool. It was very surreal to be, having Stan submit a script, and I'm going through it with a red pencil like an editor. And, well, Stan, I think this works and that doesn't work. And shockingly, he didn't just say, shut up, sign the voucher and print it. He actually went through every one of my suggestions and edits, and the ones he agreed with, he said, that's great, it makes it better. The ones he didn't agree with, he argued, but he said, it's your decision. That was a really weird thing. And over the years, I worked with him on numerous projects. And then when I left Marvel in the mid-'90s, interestingly, I actually worked with him more, because any company I went to, I worked for a number of internet animation and comic startups. And so any company I went to, I was the guy that knew Stan. So I actually got to know him better as a person and as a colleague after I left Marvel, up through his death, really, and researching the biography of him. And then for a few years, I was his regular moderator at the Wizard World comic conventions that were all over the country. So, but it's funny. I need to make up some story about the first time I met Stan, because I don't have a story, and everybody asks me. So I need to just,
make one up,
make up some great story about, my first meeting with him.
Yeah.
I think, when you discover that genius is also a human being,
Yeah.
it's, that's the, we always have like in a movie, it's like this momentous, occasion or something. In
Right.
real life, it's just sort of like meeting your new boss or,
And
like,
usually it's, and then the movie, it's always you're doing something really stupid,
mhm.
and your lifelong idol comes up, and
Mhm.
even Stan has, himself had great stories about when he was an usher before he worked at Marvel when he was a teenager. He'd gone to DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx, and he graduated, and he had a job
Frogs.
as as an usher at the Rivoli Theater in Midtown, in the theater district. And
Oh,
um,
cool.
one day Eleanor Roosevelt came in, and he was so nervous about, impressing her that he actually tripped on somebody had their foot out in the aisle, and Stan tripped, and Mrs. Roosevelt had to help him stand up. So Stan, I have no idea if that story really happened, but Stan had a great story
You can
about
use
Eleanor Roosevelt.
you can use my Neil Adams story. I met Neil Adams at the urinal at a convention. It's like it's like, oh, Neil Adams are pissing next to each other. That's an awkward.
Well, so even your heroes have to take a leak.
Right, exactly.
Right. At least you didn't turn around during it or something. But,
Well, that would make a good story too.
yeah.
Turning.
Like, I want to
It's like, let me
shake your hand.
But I mean, I think, sort of in a way, what I was saying, the thing about Stan and kind of, quote unquote, meeting him in the comics. I mean, that was really his gift, was to be able to make everybody really reading those comics feel like he was speaking personally to you. That was really a talent that he had, and making you feel like you were getting inside information and hearing all the corny jokes, and that really bonded a lot of my generation, but I think a lot of generations, to the company, and it made us forgive a lot of not very good stories.
Right,
Everybody
right.
remembers all the great Marvel stories, the Master Planner saga, the Galactus saga. Those guys were cranking out stuff, by the yard every month. There were a lot of stories that weren't so great, but we forgave them because it was still
Right.
our pals Stan and Jack and Steve and all the
Right.
other, and Marie and
You
Flo,
remember the good
everybody
things.
making those stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they did have that sense of humor, like even in something that could have been as dark as Spider-Man.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah,
That he had such a, witty way about him, rather than like the brooding Batman or something.
well yeah, that whole idea of Spider-Man as a smart ass, and saying the thing right that right you always come away from some situation going,
Mm.
boy, I wish I would have said this to that guy. Everybody's great at Monday morning quarterbacking their own lives. I should have said that. I should have done. And what Peter Parker did was he said the stuff. Even though something about putting on the Spider-Man costume that liberated kind of Peter Parker, to be able to say those things and project a confidence that maybe he didn't really feel. That was a great part of, and I think there was kind of an equal, synergy between Stan Lee and Steve Ditko in
Mm.
those first few years of Spider-Man, where they both, I think they both had that in their experience. I mean, I think Stan was maybe a more personable guy. I don't think he was ever shy. This is the guy who did, paint on the ceiling of the. He was involved with the school kind of literary magazine called the Magpie, and he's the guy who wrote on the ceiling, who painted on the ceiling, Stan Lee is God, or Stan Lieber is God, whatever he was
Right,
calling
right,
himself. So
right,
clearly he was not that shy.
right.
But I think there was a part of him that understood what it was to be picked on and misunderstood, and
Right.
And underestimated. For all his confidence and
Mhm.
bravado, which is a word I learned from a Marvel comic. I think I think he got that as much as say Ditko, who was more famously introverted and shy.
Right, right. And Larry was his brother, wasn't it? Larry Lieber?
And Larry is still around. Larry was doing the Spider-Man newspaper strip
Yeah, I have one on my
about
wall.
2 years ago. Yeah, he and Larry were brothers, and Larry's still around. He was the kid. Larry's the kid brother. He's only 88.
Mm.
Uh,
Only a kid, 88.
but he's still very much with it. I mean, and Larry was very generous with his sharing his memories of growing up as Stan's brother, and they had a very complicated, relationship. Above and beyond being siblings was also the fact that A, they were in the same business, and B, Stan was the most famous person that ever lived in that business. So even though
Right,
Larry was and is an
right.
excellent writer and artist on his own, he still had
He's
the
under the shadow of his
the
brother.
shadow of the most famous guy that ever lived in the same business.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. It's like, did he have any other siblings? Did he have any sisters or anything? Or was it just him and Larry?
Just him and Larry.
Wow, yeah. So he was like I wouldn't even say number two because everyone thought Stan, then you hear Jack, and then of course, then you hear Ditko. Those are the
Right.
names that you would hear. Larry was there, but they did give him credit for one of the movies. I
Oh, and
realized.
he got credit. Larry, I mean, look, this, of course, is the source of endless
Hmm.
debate and covered in
Hmm.
the book, to a degree. In the book, I tried to make it enough inside baseball for comic fans that there'd be stuff they didn't know, but
Hmm.
not so in such minute detail that people who weren't obsessed with these things would be bored by.
Right.
Yeah, Larry in the comics was the way those stories were credited. Say the first Thor story, the first Ant-Man story, the first Iron Man
Hmm.
story was plot by Stan Lee, script by Larry Lieber, and then art by Jack or Don Heck.
Mm.
And the way Larry, so yes, in the recent movies, I think in the Thor movies, and maybe even in Iron Man, in a few of them, it's
Yeah, he was
by
credited.
Stan Lee,
And
Larry Lieber, and Jack Kirby.
yeah, I also think the last Avengers film that came out, I think they also credited him on that as
Yeah.
well. Yeah.
Well, what Larry would do, Stan would give him a premise for a story, maybe a paragraph. Now, of course, the big debate is, did
Hmm.
Stan get that from talking to Jack first and then put it in the, this is
Right. Where did it originate from?
where it originated. But in any case, Larry would get like a paragraph or
Hmm.
two. And then since Larry is by nature an artist as well as a writer, he would literally sit down and draw thumbnails of the entire story. Then he would go to a typewriter and type up, page one. He did not work what's called Marvel style. He didn't work
Right.
first. He
He
wrote
was doing it the old style, the
the old
golden age
style. He
style.
wrote, panel description, dialogue, panel description,
Hmm.
dialogue.
Hmm.
Uh, and then you can sort of see, I mean, while I'm sure that Kirby and the other guys might have had the freedom to deviate from whatever Larry wrote, you can feel that they're paced differently,
Right. Right.
as if somebody had been, giving them kind of a shot-by-shot description.
Right. Yeah. I think as an artist myself too, I mean, when I was younger, when I wanted to be a writer, I just went straight to the keyboard and typed. But as I became more undisciplined and older, I
Mhm.
just go to the pencil, just start drawing, and I'll draw all the scenes that I have in my head, and I'll put the dialogue in last. Like I know what's going to happen. I don't know what they're saying. But sometimes it's a combination of both,
Do you have an outline, though, of what you're going to be
No, I just go on the fly, literally.
All those lessons that I tried to teach you when you took my writing course went right out the window, Ray.
It's like,
All
I
that
know.
stuff about starting with an outline.
I know.
Well, I mean, I was teaching. I mean, as I recall, I was teaching writing courses first at NYU's adult ed, then at the New School. But then I was involved very much with the old Museum of Comic and Cartoon Art,
Yeah, so we
and
met through
I
there.
was their I was their senior vice president of education. I was also the only member of the education department, but so I was organizing and teaching courses, and one thing I taught was comics writing workshops. Right? I mean, that's what I remember me and you took.
It was before that. It was
What did we
at
actually?
Big Apple.
Okay.
I was inviting you to the Bronx Heroes Con,
Oh,
and then you were like, "Well, I don't know," and I said, "Well, uh, Irwin's coming, so you have to come," and you're like, "Oh, Irwin's going? Okay, I'm gonna be there."
so the Bronx Heroes was before the writing course?
Yeah, it
Okay.
was probably like maybe 4 or 5 years before. Yeah.
You know, I have deep Bronx
Yeah.
roots, so I'm
Yeah.
always interested in doing stuff involving the Bronx. And yeah, and Irwin Hazen was this elderly cartoonist who worked on Justice League, Justice Society, and Wonder Woman, and
Yeah.
Green Lantern back in the 40s. And
Yeah.
then, of course, he was most well known for a comic strip called Dondi that went from the
Dondi
50s
was
to the
massive.
80s.
Mm-hmm.
And yet he did the local Big Apple cons.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got I got to know Irwin through that. I also got to know Irwin because the guy Alan Rosenberg, who was one of the people involved in running the Big Apple cons, also was an art teacher in New Jersey, and he would have a fundraising con for the art department in his school. And so I remember I'd drive out there with Ken Wong and Jim Salicrup and Irwin and Arnold Drake too.
And Arnold Drake, wow, yeah, I met him once. Yeah, he was a funny guy too.
Those were incredible rides. So that's
yeah.
Yeah,
I actually picked you up and Irwin to the show. Yeah, we drove together.
Oh, I remember that. That's right.
We were stuck in traffic.
Yeah, and Irwin, Irwin was a big, was a short, peppy guy. He was in his 90s, but he had his wits about him, and remembered everything, and remembered every grudge he ever held in his life.
I still have that interview of him with Mark Maz at that show, talking about.
If you don't mind, speaking of Comic Con, wasn't Stan Lee one of the originators of the creation of of these Comic Cons?
For the Marvel one, yeah.
Not really. I mean, Stan. Roy Thomas was more. Stan. Look, Stan was in comics since 1940. Right, he graduated to Whit Clinton in 1939. He had a few different kinds of jobs, including like writing obituaries, which he found very depressing, writing about living people as if they were dead. He delivered sandwiches. He did some like public relations and advertising work, but he was distantly related to the owner of Marvel. So everybody thinks Marvel started in 1961 with Fantastic Four #1, but Stan had been a comics professional for 20 years before that.
Right. Atlas.
So and Kirby even longer. Ditko was a little bit younger. He started in the mid-50s. All these guys have interesting life stories, which again I go into in the book. But so Stan was invited. So the first shows were started by Phil Suling, and before him a guy named Bernie Bubner. There were some very early shows in '64, and I think maybe Stan. I don't remember the first one Stan went to, but he didn't invent them, but I think he early on realized how important they could be. If what he was about, Marvel had been a huge company. In the 40s and 50s, they put out 75, 80 titles a month in every genre. Millions of people, everybody worked for Stan or for Timely, Marvel, or Atlas. It went by different names. And then they had a big implosion in '57. That's when they became that little engine that could, from which emerged and almost went out of business. And from that emerged Fantastic Four and this whole phenomenon that we now know as Marvel. So I think Stan early on saw they were a group of people who'd been kids in the 40s and were reading them then, and had still kept up an interest in comics now that they were in their teens and 20s. Will Eisner similarly, I think, saw this, that there was an audience that liked reading comic books and had an interest in the characters, but wanted something a little more sophisticated than what they'd read when they were children.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this whole fandom movement: Jerry Bales, Roy Thomas,
Mm-hmm.
Don and Maggie Thompson. There were a number of people. Stan figured out, so did Julie Schwartz at DC, that could be important to helping grow the business and his company specifically. So I think either in person or sending Flo or sending Roy to the shows, but Stan did not invent the Comic-Con. That in the 70s, Marvel had its own branded convention, so maybe that's what you're thinking.
Was that in 75, I think, right? Was that in
75, 76.
Or 70s, yeah.
But at that point, I guess the most famous, San Diego had started in 1970 and was growing a little each year. The big comic convention in the 70s was the New York Comic Con, which has nothing to do with the current New York Comic Con.
Yeah.
That was brought by
Roosevelt?
Phil Stooling, who kind of was one of the people, excuse me, who helped invent the direct market and the comic book shop phenomenon. It's very interesting. All these things kind of overlap with each other.
Yeah.
Stan was, in a sense, the product that they were selling at these conventions.
Right, he was a cheerleader. Yeah.
Cheerleader and a celebrity, and in that he wasn't the celebrity he would become with the Marvel cameos and
Right.
the later TV shows, but he realized early on that Marvel could be marketed like an advertising campaign. And that's where he came up with all the slogans, the Make Mine Marvel and the Merry Marvel Marching Society and enough, a lot of the Marvel slogans, Face Front, Enough Said, were actually I think they were things that guys said in the Army. He was a World War II veteran. I think a lot of those were
military slang.
Rolled over from the military, yeah.
I can see that. Yeah, that makes sense. The way they talk, the way Jack Kirby talked. Then you have all these veterans coming back and then talking the way they spoke in the military because they're all military. They have that in common, so I could see that they're using the same jargon in the business.
And I think a lot of the fathers of the readers had that in common too.
That's true. Yes, very very much so. That was the good war, as they say, right? So it's like So at what year did he stop working in the comics and then moves to California to start working on the TV production? Do you touch up on that in your book?
It was a gradual thing. He became, the comics, like I said, he was the editor-in-chief from the time, Simon and Kirby created Captain America, then had a falling out with Martin Goodman, the owner. Guess what? Over money. Who would have thought, huh? So they left, and Stan was kind of the acting. He was 18, 19 years old. He was the acting editor-in-chief, except they never found anybody, except for those few years he went to the Army where a guy named Vince Fago filled in. Stan was the editor-in-chief, and people like Al Jaffe worked under him, and even Jerry Robinson, who, co-created the Joker, worked under him. Everybody went through Marvel timely. Then the Marvel phenomenon happened in the early 60s. Then Goodman sells the company to a corporation called the Cadence Corporation, but sticks around as publisher for 4 years. And then he leaves in 72, and his Cadence had made a verbal promise that Martin's son would be able to become the publisher. And Stan is thinking, I've been here 30 years. I'm going to be the publisher or I'm leaving. And, he called their bluff. And so he became publisher. So starting then is when he stopped writing and editing the comics. Roy Thomas came in as editor-in-chief. Stan spent time then on more kind of global things. That's when they got into the black and white comics and more horror comics. The Comics Code eased up around that time. So and he more and more would be involved with the animation and the Hollywood stuff and the Hulk TV show and the Spider-Man TV show.
Right.
Spent a lot of time on the West Coast, which is really what he wanted.
Mhm.
to be doing. And by 1980 he was living there, so it was gradual, but
Right.
he always wanted to do it. So by 1980 he was full time, and then he really, again, we look at it now and go, oh, these movies make billions and billions of dollars, and the cartoons and the
Yeah, that
video
wasn't the
games.
case back then.
There were years, people talk about he was almost like Willy Loman in a way, like Death of a Salesman, or just be Stan schlepping from one studio to another, and nobody taking everybody. Everybody. Stan Lee could get a meeting with anybody because he was Stan Lee, and everybody had a sentimental feeling about
Right.
him because they'd read the Marvel comics.
Yeah.
But I think it really took a generation or two of Hollywood executives to retire and die.
Right, because they
And
didn't see it
because
serious.
everybody loved Stan. Stan got a meeting, but nobody thought that these characters had any potential, beyond Saturday morning cartoons. And I guess the Hulk show was an outlier that was popular.
Yeah, I remember there was a Spider-Man TV show that wasn't very good in the
It
late.
was,
I love that show.
Yeah.
Nicholas Hammond. Everybody remembered the Batman TV show and thought the only way to approach this stuff was kind of to simultaneously make fun of it and treat it like a spoof.
Right.
And,
Which I despise, because they're doing that again with this Harley Quinn movies
right.
and
But
Deadpool.
at least now it's such they're superheroes are their own genre now, so
Right.
they can do subgenres, I guess.
Yeah.
But I think it almost took maybe. I think it wasn't until Star Wars, which, let's face it, was really a Marvel comic.
Right, that's true. Before it came out before the actual movie. That's
I
right.
think it took Star Wars. Well, I mean, but even just the way it was treated, that it took itself seriously,
Right.
and people went to it. And the Superman movie, which again, even the first Superman movie had a lot of that. That self.
Yeah, they say the word shit in the first Superman movie. Most
Right.
people forget that.
I remember with Star Wars, it kind of reminded me of like I had just happened to have seen like some of the on PBS back then, the old Buster Crab Flash Gordons from like the 30s, I think, and 40s, or and you could see where they just took that and put in a lot of philosophical stuff with it, but it had that kind of feel.
And you could also see that Darth Vader was kind of Doctor Doom. I mean, let's face it.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I mean, but the idea that a movie like that could be not just aimed at 8-year-olds, but that it could be aimed at teenagers and adults and take itself seriously. Right, that was when things started shifting, and even then, it took. That was 1977. Superman was 78.
Yeah.
Still, it wasn't. I mean, also Marvel shot itself in the foot a lot with this too. Because I remember saying they could not get a movie going. I guess the Batman movies were successful, and even they had a hard time taking themselves seriously. It took a long time, and then Marvel had been careless. If you remember, '91. I was editing. I was running the Spider-Man line, and I got a treatment from James Cameron for a Spider-Man movie.
Oh,
well, everybody heard about that.
That was a Titanic cast. The cast from Titanic was supposed to do Spider-Man first.
Schwarzenegger and as a villain. I forget who was going to play Spider-Man. But what happened was, of course,
DiCaprio, I think.
huh?
I think it was DiCaprio.
Probably was.
It was DiCaprio and Winslet were supposed to be Mary Jane and
Seriously, was that? That's
yeah. So the
know,
idea was that he was going to do Spider-Man, but he wanted to do this Titanic movie first.
right.
So and then Titanic they thought was going to be a flop, and then it was a hit, and then they were like, "Oh, forget it, Spider-Man."
But the other thing that happened is once became known that Cameron was involved with Spider-Man, Marvel had a habit over the years of signing away overlapping rights to their properties because they couldn't imagine anybody would ever do anything with them.
Right.
So whether intentionally or just carelessly, so suddenly James Cameron is announced, and 12 different people go, "I have the exclusive rights to this contract," which is why it took 10 years from that to the
to make the actual movie.
So Marvel, was its own worst enemy with a lot of these things, but it took a long time. So Stan was out there in the wilderness, never giving up hope on stuff. And also, I think he spent a lot of time pitching his own ideas. I've been to his archives at the University of Wyoming, oddly enough, in Laramie. You have to take a plane called the Vomit Comet to get there. You have to really want to go. And
sounds like a road trip.
There's like, when I was there were 100 boxes of files. Now there are 200. I mean, it's really pretty fascinating if you're willing to make that trip. And the people there are great. But you can see boxes full of proposals for movies and TV shows, some with Marvel characters, some just, of Stan's own ideas or in collaboration with people. He spent a lot of time there trying to get things off the ground. And as much as people may have liked him, nobody had faith that these superheroes would have a wide appeal.
Yeah, I was reading an old comic book from the 90s, a Marvel book, and they had announced that John Singleton was supposed to direct Wesley Snipes as Black Panther.
Probably, yeah.
And I was like, when did that happen? So it was in the works. They announced it in the book, in the news section, the newsletter section. But then it never happened.
What about the Silver Surfer movie with Olivia Newton-John? Not as the surfer, but
right, yeah. So
her boyfriend at the time was a producer who wanted to do the Silver. I think that's partly why that Silver Surfer graphic novel happened in the late 70s.
That's right. The really
that was going to be
realistic,
tied into the worldwide Silver Surfer craze.
He was a sympathetic character.
I mean, it still probably would have been better than Xanadu.
Well, Xanadu was a whole other... I made a lot of money on Xanadu, actually.
Oh, you did?
Well, we did. I was the assistant editor on the Marvel Super Special adaptation.
Oh! You mean they actually made a comic book out of the movie?
A comic book. It was like a magazine.
Oh, okay.
The first half was the comic, because what makes more sense than making a comic out of a musical? What could be more natural for the kids to want? So it was a comic adaptation written by J.M. DeMatteis. It was one of his first things at Marvel.
Really?
He's
such a good writer.
Louis Simonson was the editor. I was the assistant. And they wanted it to be a magazine. So it was the first half. And then they would decide, and then again, it was, we're going to do it. We have technology to just shoot it from pencils, which they didn't really. So it was really a wild, crazy ride. But the second half of it was a lot of articles about the making of Xanadu. And I mean, the special effects in that movie were done by the same company that did the special effects for the credits on the Superman movie.
Oh, wow.
Greenberg Associates, who have gone on to become one of the biggest special effects and advertising houses on both coasts. So I went to interview the Greenberg brothers and see their whole operation, which was weird. They had this studio in a building on like West 38th Street that almost looked like they'd taken a Hollywood lot and plopped it down on near the Port Authority, because it looked like a Hollywood built, like those buildings you see with a big parking lot, which no place in Manhattan has.
Right, not anymore.
So they did that, I wrote all these articles, and so they, I made a nice freelance. Aside from being, my day job being the assistant editor, I made a lot of money writing the making of articles. And who, you remember who the producer of that movie was?
Who was it?
Joel Silver.
No way, really? Wow.
So Joel Silver comes in. This is before he was Joel Silver.
Right.
Action, guy produced the that franchise with a lot of big action movies. Of course, I'm blanking on them. He was one of the big Hollywood action, but this before that. So, he comes in and he brings all the people in the office who'd worked on the comic to a preview screening, like in a screening room in the East 50s. And, when you work on a project, you come to believe in it, no matter what it is. And,
Right.
Gene Kelly looked like, who starred in the movie, looked just like John Romita. So we were inclined to love it. So all of us who worked on Xanadu were in the screening room. And we're really, I bet this is going to be great. We know how it was made, and we have all these insider views. And then, of course, the movie goes on. And it was really like the audience at Springtime for Hitler. I mean, we all sat there with our mouths wide open. And suddenly, when it was over, we all suddenly had some meeting or lunch. We had something we had to do to get the hell out of there, because we did not stick around and have to talk about it. But all told, Xanadu, paid my rent for a month or two. So I can't.
That's great.
Right.
Did you make any royalties on the Dazzler appearing in the last X-Men movie, or?
I did not create the Dazzler, so I did not.
You did write some issues, though, right?
I wrote more issues of the Dazzler than any human living or dead.
I have all of them.
Well, have I signed them yet? That might reduce the value. I don't know. Yeah, I wrote.
No, you haven't.
Somebody had to write the Dazzler, and I did. I just wrote. I don't know if it's come out yet. I think it may be on sale now. They did a Dazzler Masterworks that I wrote the forward to.
Really?
So if you're a real completist, and the current world situation has not wiped out all your disposable income,
right?
Yes, the Dazzler Masterworks with an introduction by me is available.
That's great. I want to ask you about that. Even though Dazzler, people look at it, nowadays like a disco thing, she was the longest and probably the only female X-Men character to have the longest running book, because Rogue and Storm always had miniseries, but they never had their own ongoing series. I mean, she lasted for what, almost 2 decades, correct?
The comic? No, I think the comic...
It's like 94, 95, something like that when it ended.
It started in maybe
80?
81.
Yeah.
No, I think the first run only went until the mid or late 80s. She might have been in miniseries, or I think
she was, I've seen that. Oh, I'll have to look upstairs, but I think she went all the way into 95 into that whole Long Shot, because she was a love interest of Long Shot.
I don't think her comic I think her comic lasted till like the late 80s.
It was over a decade though, right? Almost.
Maybe just about a decade.
Yeah.
I think there was interest in the character, so maybe she was in miniseries. I have to say, I didn't really follow her that closely after.
Then that's probably the longest running female lead comic book, probably.
I think Spider-Girl, especially.
And Spider-Girl, yeah.
But, I think even, it definitely got to 100, and I think if you count all the different miniseries, maybe even over 100. I mean, Tom and Ron Friends, and Tom DeFalco, Ron Friends, Tom DeFalco, Pat Olaf, that, I think, sort of was the stealth longest running female lead Marvel comic.
Right. So where can we find your website, and where can we find your book?
Well, website DannyFingeroth.com, so is my website. The book is available everywhere. It's called The Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee. It's available, obviously, as a print book, as a digital book, as a large type version if you're in need of that, and there's an audio book that I read myself.
Oh, really?
So if listening to me for the past half hour or more has been an incredibly uplifting experience, then just imagine. No, I've gotten a lot of compliments on the book, and I worked with a lot of good people doing it. It was.
Then whoever really invented the specific first wave of Marvel characters, however the stories were developed, there was one consistent, singular, call it omniscient voice, telling you the stories and, as importantly, welcoming you into the world of Marvel. That voice had a name in the real world and in the magazine's pages. That name was Stan Lee. It was the voice that told you, starting with the third issue, that Fantastic Four was the world's greatest comic.
You know, as a native Manhattanite, I used to delude myself into thinking I didn't have a New York accent, but enough reviews have pointed out my New York accent that I guess I do, you know. Yes, but the book it's put out, it's published by St. Martin's Press, Macmillan, so it's available everywhere, and Amazon has a crazy cheap price on it now. It's
Really? I'm going to get it now.
like a third or more off, you know. So, you know, I got to figure out some way that people can get it. Now that I was supposed to do all sorts of conventions and personal appearances, and now I'm obviously not doing those. So I got to figure out some way to, if somebody wants it signed, to mail it out. But you know, everything is so up in the air. But I'll find out from the post office or from FedEx what the best way to do that is, and I'll let people know through my website. I'm also on Facebook, Twitter, all the usual suspects.
Yeah, Twitter and all that stuff is great. Thanks for coming on. Appreciate it. Gentlemen, did you have any questions for the legendary Danny Fingeroth?
Danny Fingeroth. I'm so legendary.
I have a question. What would you say to someone who's getting into comic books today? You know, because it's so different than what it was when Stan Lee.
As a fan or as a creator?
As a creator, as someone who wants, like, for instance, you know, your friend Felix here, Ray Felix. I mean, he's been doing comics, writing, and drawings for many years. What would you say to someone who's trying to get into it now?
Well, I think Ray is doing the right thing. I mean, look, if you live in New York or near New York, or I guess in near LA, you could always try to get a job as an intern or an assistant at one of the companies. That's a good way to get people to know your name and face. But I think to do your own comics and get them in front of people, if you're a writer and looking for an artist, then you probably do have to spend some money to get a decent artist to do it. If you're an artist, maybe you need to spend some money to partner up with a writer. But I think, you know, the good news and bad news is with the internet now, there's more ways than ever to get your work out there. The idea is, how do you get people to notice it? I mean, conventions were a big part of that, but this is something that I myself am sort of trying to solve this puzzle of how do you get heard above all the noise on the internet, but then once you do, you know, have something good that people will be interested in, you know. But that's, you know, right now it's more like show business than ever, you know. I mean, I think when comics was a little bit of a closed shop, and, you know, say in the 70s and 80s, when there weren't that many people, I mean, there were plenty of people looking to get in, but you didn't have to worry that somebody, you know, 10,000 miles away would have this cool website to show their work on. You know, the competition now is so crazy. So I think, you know, I mean, it's, you know, I think ultimately do good work. And if you can get a job at a company some way as an intern or an assistant, you know, I think even in the age of the internet, that you could be the person that can be there in an hour still doesn't hurt. You know, I think there's still something, maybe not this week or this month, but the idea of actual in-person human interaction, and come in, take a meeting, pick up a pencil, draw this, write that. You know, I mean, you know, I used to, and sometimes I still do, interview people a lot, and I always ask them, how did they break in? And everybody's got a different story.
Mm-hmm.
There's no one way, you know.
Right. There's no one way. That's so true.
I mean, have they been, is there like any sort of digital platform or comic books still sold mostly through print? Or is anybody like reading them online now?
Oh, no, now this is a real inflection point, because up until, you know, a month ago, comics were, whereas every other print form was going more and more digital. I think even that was leveling out and people were getting into owning print books. The idea of the comic book shop where people could go and buy their comics and hang out with other people who dug comics and talk about them, that I think kept this whole culture of print comics alive.
Thriving.
You know, I think right now, but for the past 10 years, everything's been available digitally. You know, Marvel has its own web, sells its own comics to read. There's a site called Comixology, which is owned by Amazon, which has more comics than you could read in 10 lifetimes. You know, comics and there's a whole world of comics, you know, by people like Raina Telgemeier through Scholastic. You know, a lot of people have never heard of Raina. She's literally the most popular graphic novelist in the world. You know, so, but a lot of stuff.
Is she like a YA writer? Is that why? Because
Writer and artist.
that's the largest market right now. I
Yeah,
need to
which is great.
adjust my brain and start doing YA books.
You know, it's a huge market, and I mean, I'm very happy about that because I think there were several generations of kids that didn't grow up loving comics, and so didn't become adults loving comics. Right? Everybody knows Spider-Man. Everybody knows.
Very true.
But they know, but most of them don't read. I think now there's a comics reading. I know this is a longer answer than you wanted to your question.
It's okay.
Comics are all over the internet. They're, you know, free, for pay. Marvel and DC certainly have them available. Archie does. You know, the question now, I think the medium of comics is healthier than it's been in a long time. Whether that model of the direct market comic book shop that everybody knows and loves is sustainable is now you know, with the virus and the quarantining, that's going to be interesting to see. But man, oh man, comics are available all over the place, both the well-known ones by Marvel and DC, and both stuff that you never heard of, and tons of comic strips online. This has been true the whole, you know, past 20 years or more of the digital era. If you're willing, you know, whether you want just the Marvel DC stuff or you're interested in exploring a whole other world of comics, man, oh man, the art form is more vibrant, richer than ever.
Yeah, I see when I do shows in other states and I go through the artist alley of self-publishers, I think the self-publishing market is a huge boom right now because it started out where you would see the same people in every show in the artist alley. Now it seems like there's different enclaves from state to state, and some people don't cross over at those shows, bless you. And that's I think that's a real threat to these huge corporations because there's no overhead. These are people making it in their homes.
Right. It's the most democratic medium. I mean, all you need is a piece of paper and a pencil.
Right.
But look, Marvel and DC and Archie and the other, I mean, they're as much in the intellectual property business. They're obviously making their money more from movies, TV shows, branded merchandise, clothes. I mean, the comics, I think they're making more money from the comics than people think because they repackage them so many ways and
right.
But
and licensing, of course.
Right, but I mean the actual comic books are they're certainly at least cheap research and development, so I don't think they're going away. But whether people access them digitally or in print is remains to be seen. But but those those companies are owned by Marvel is owned by Disney. DC is owned, I guess, ultimately by AT&T, who are having they're having some problems, but in general,
they started letting off. 5% of their staff was let go.
Yeah. Well, look, again, we're in this real. I mean, and Bob Iger has come back to, I think, out of semi-retirement to try to, deal with the challenges. But ultimately, these properties are such moneymakers. I don't think you have to worry about those companies. It's the smaller companies and the individual practitioners. But people, a lot of people who make comics have day jobs because as much as they love the medium, even successful popular creators, it's all over the place. But boy, there's sure lots of places to read comics and download them, and I'm not even talking about the illegal pirate bays because
Right.
or because they were illegal.
Right, yeah.
But I hear there's a lot of comics available that way too.
Right. I find it interesting in Japan they have a lot what they call fan comics. So they'll have fans that publish licensed material, and then the Japanese are okay with that. But here they'll come at you with a lawyer.
That's all over the map. I mean, look, at conventions, they certainly have not come over, thankfully. If somebody is sketching Spider-Man, especially somebody who's done it in the past at a convention,
Right.
unless that person is actively suing, Marvel
Right.
or DC, I've never heard of them coming down on those people, which is
Right.
good. I mean, in theory, those people
Right.
actually have the right to do that, but the companies kind of turn a blind eye.
Blind eye to, yeah.
Living.
Very true. But I find it funny. I don't do any fan art at shows or stories, or I don't even like to draw characters for people at the shows.
Right.
I'm primarily there for selling my book.
Well, everybody's got to.
And
if there are shows again, that'll be interesting to see.
Yeah.
How that comes back.
Yeah. But I always felt that these independent artists should stop doing fan art and just start, but it's very lucrative. But
Yeah.
if they focus on their own properties, like a friend of mine spent like $30,000 on doing a fan show on Batman. And I was like, well, imagine if you did your own stuff and invested that money instead of doing fan stuff, you'd put yourself on the map with 30 grand,
I guess it depends what your passion is. If his passion is Batman, then,
Right.
He loved Batman to this day, people still lining up to draw for Marvel and DC. I mean, their check's clear. That's a good thing. But I think also if you wanna work on Batman or Spider-Man,
Right.
I was thinking more of, say, people who had been artists over the years for the company weren't getting regular work and do sketches of those characters at conventions,
Right.
But I guess there's no way that's a real fine legal point. Like, well, this guy drew Spider-Man in the 80s, so he's got the right to draw it at a con, whereas
I agree with. Yeah, that I agree with. Yeah.
But this guy never did. But how do you, that
Right.
suddenly, who's got the right to, so I think it's just as well that the cons, the companies, at least so far, are not.
Well, according to the contracts they signed, neither one can do it.
Right. Well,
technically, from a legal standpoint. Yeah.
Well, that's it. But I think, so far they have not been hard nosed about that.
Very true. Very true. Thanks so much for coming on. I appreciate you coming on, and
thank you for inviting me. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's been amazing.
Like I say, it's been great having you here. And I think we've learned a lot about the industry and about Stan Lee.
Okay,
So
I'm going to buy the book right now on Amazon. I'm going on my phone right now to order a copy.
You want the audio book, Ray. You want the audio book.